I love learning languages. I live for that moment when I see someone's eyes light up because I've said a phrase in their native language. And apparently, I'm not the only one. Many of you love learning languages too. So in this video, I'm going to talk about different ways that I learn a language using a variety of tools, including Obsidian, and specifically how I recently learned Swedish from scratch in 30 days. For many people, the goal of language learning is obvious. It's to become fluent in that language. But I think that's a little like starting a new job in a new field and immediately planning to be the CEO. Why don't you try it a little bit first and see if you even like the job? I think that that's really daunting, and for that reason, I like to set a smaller, more specific, and concrete goal. For my Swedish challenge, I just wanted to be able to introduce myself in Swedish and talk a bit about who I am, why I'm learning Swedish, and what I was doing in Stockholm. Because I had a work trip scheduled for 1 week, I was going to be in Stockholm, Sweden, with my work colleagues, whom I've been working with some for over a year, and that had never met in person. COVID, you know. But I wanted to be able to just say a few phrases about myself in their native language. So it was a very specific, concrete goal that I ended up achieving. When I learn a language, I also like to think about what are some activities I can do in that language that would make it actually fun. I'm pretty lucky because for most languages, what's fun for me is actually speaking it with people. And so I like to jump right into that. Speaking from day one sounds like a very daunting task, but for me, it gives me the most motivation because that is usually the thing that I want from learning a language. And so going right to it keeps me going. For some languages like Swedish, where I'm not entirely sure about the pronunciation or the rhythm of the language, I like to start with an audio course that gives me a few phrases right from the beginning that I can repeat to myself, and then I can kind of start to train my ears and my speech based on that. And my favorite audio course for this is Pimsleur, just because they have a wide variety of languages. And they do get repetitive, so I don't tend to finish the entire lessons. Depending on the language, you can have, up to 20 in the first one, and then you can have different levels as well. I usually just like to do maybe 10, just until I get a feel for it and can move on to something a little bit more natural.
This is Unit 1 of Pimsleur's Swedish. Listen to this conversation.
Ursäkta, förstår du engelska?
Nej, jag förstår inte engelska.
And then once I'm done with that, I move on to probably my favorite method of learning languages, and that's using a service called Italki. Italki is a platform I've been using for literally years. I have learned so many different languages on it. Italki lets you connect with other people who are speaking the language that you want to learn. So you can just join it for free and then do language exchanges with people that want to speak your language and who speak the language that you want to learn. However, I often don't have time for that because obviously the learning time is cut in half because I'm having to teach a language as well. So I just prefer to pay and get either a community tutor or a formal teacher. And I tend to go for the informal community tutor. And what that is someone who's just a native speaker who may not know all of the intricacies of grammar, but is perfectly happy to spend some time talking to you. And then the formal teacher I reserve for languages where I know I'm going to want to learn it more in detail. For Swedish, I just did community tutors. I ended up doing 12 lessons over 3 weeks, and that was with two teachers in particular, Felicity and Mel. I recommend them both highly, and I'll leave a link to their Italki profiles as well because they were great teachers. In Obsidian, I have a project page called Learn Swedish, and that's where I had some of my resources, and I had like this checklist of things that I wanted to get done. But I also have this data view query, which is going through files that have the name Mel or Felicia in them. And that's because those are the names of my teachers. So let's have a look at one of these. This is one of my early lessons with Mel. You'll see that for language learning, I use a similar template to the one that I use for meetings. I always ask the teachers to type out what they're saying so that I can see it written as well. And that will be fed into my system for flashcards, which I will get to in a bit. After these lessons, I start to have questions about the grammar, and sometimes I'll ask the teachers. Often, because I use community tutors, they may not be able to answer from a grammatical perspective, and sometimes I'll just then research it myself. So, for example, in this page, I have some notes on Swedish gender because they have two genders, but they're not like the typical feminine and masculine from Romance languages like Spanish. In fact, Swedish is much more like Dutch, where the two genders are common and neuter. So I have some et and en words here. I'm using callouts to summarize grammatical points. And in this case, this was actually a summary from one of my lessons with Mel, where she talked about the gender in Swedish. In this case, I definitely have an advantage in learning Swedish because I already know, or at least have studied, 3 different Germanic languages that are similar. That's English, German, and Dutch. And so I found it useful here to compare Swedish with 2 of my stronger ones. I also like that I can hide some of these callouts. So if we go into the code here, you'll see that I'm using this minus sign, and that means that this is going to be automatically collapsed. So I don't bombard myself with a lot of information, but if I am wondering about the difference between de, dem, dom, dem is also pronounced dom, then I can expand this and I'll get a little bit more of an explanation. At this point, I also start thinking about the things that I already do every day, like watching YouTube videos, and starting to think about how I can inject some Swedish flavor into that. So one of the first things that I did was to ask my Swedish colleagues what Swedish YouTube channels they follow. So I ended up finding a few that I like to sometimes watch. Honestly, at this stage, I didn't really understand what was happening or what they were saying exactly, but it still honed my intuition for the cadence of the language, which is not something that is easily taught. I mean, I thought it was fun. YouTube is a platform I hang out on already. And so having that in my daily routine was just really helpful, especially for days when I wasn't actively studying Swedish. By the way, in case you haven't noticed, I have captions on all of my videos. I actually pay for that separately because Google's auto-translate captions are pretty awful. And so I pay for a service to caption my videos. And that makes it so that one, the English subtitles are way better quality than the auto-translate subtitles would be. And also because they're better, you can turn on CC down there and then click the cogwheel and auto-translate to pretty much any language that you want. I wish all videos did this because it would really help with language learning. I love when other YouTube creators do this because then even if I understand the language that they're speaking in, say Spanish or Dutch or English, then I can still change the subtitles to, for example, Swedish. And that way I'm still hearing the language in a language that I understand, but I'm also reading Swedish subtitles. So it's a really cool way of just being able to link, the meaning of something with some Swedish words without even really thinking about it. And really steering into things that I find fun, I also bought a copy of an awesome Swedish RPG, Mörkborg, but in Swedish. I already had the English version, so I could compare the English version and the Swedish version and try to spot some differences. Now, it did mean that I acquired some non-traditional vocabulary, especially because Mörkborg says that it is a doom metal album of a game, and that's kind of cool, right? Because that's something that's very specific to what I like to do for fun. I'm talking specifically about learning human languages in this video, but prioritizing for fun is something that I do with computer languages too, and I've been using an app called Brilliant to help me learn a little every day. Brilliant is the sponsor of this video, but I'm actually hooked. I recently finished their computer science fundamentals course and moved right on over to learning Python. I've learned Python before, but the way that Brilliant does it is so interactive, you immediately see it visualized, so you see what your code is doing. They have heaps of different lessons that I really want to try. I feel like they're adding new ones all the time. And recently I also started to do a pre-algebra and algebra course. Maths is another type of language, and I've always enjoyed it in school and beyond. But the way that I learned it was very abstract. On Brilliant, everything is visualized. I've been really surprised with how much deeper I'm understanding topics on an intuitive level, in addition to the theoretical level. We are in the age of the geek, and I really love what Brilliant is doing in helping educate people in the maths and sciences. If you do too, then check out this link. It'll also be in the description, and you can sign up for free, but also 200 of you will be able to get 20% off of Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks, Brilliant! Holding conversations this early on does have its disadvantages, and one of those disadvantages is that you don't really have the vocabulary at this stage, and I'm no exception. Lots of my initial conversations are "What betyder det?" which means "what does that mean?" and "Hur säger man something?" which means "how do you say something?" på svenska, in Swedish. And that's totally okay, but here's how I try to get those things to stick in my mind. The first is Duolingo, an app that I have a love-hate relationship with. I don't think that it alone is enough for language learning, but it is very gamified. It has all the nice bells and whistles and sounds, and it is really helpful when you're starting to learn a language to give you the motivation to do something, anything in that language. I do find myself quickly outstripping Duolingo, though, in terms of the actual usable vocabulary. So things like woman, man, or child, those things might be very useful in the beginning, but as you go on, you start learning like fruits and stuff, and I don't particularly find that useful for my use cases anyway. I mean, maybe you want to learn a language so that you can go to the grocery store and ask for stuff, and in that case, maybe Duolingo would be more useful. One cool thing about Duolingo is that they also now have languages that you learn through other languages. So, for example, for Portuguese, I've actually found it more useful to learn Portuguese through Spanish than through English because Portuguese and Spanish are so similar that they're too interconnected in my mind. Having those lessons in Spanish really helps reinforce the differences. I've also had a lot of success with Memrise, which is an app that I signed up for a lifetime subscription for. And in particular, I like that they have all of these word frequency lists. So they have one for Swedish as well. And that's very useful in working my way down the most commonly used words in a language. For Swedish, I also found a cool Kindle book. Ollie Richards' short stories in Swedish was really useful because the language is a lot simpler, and then it also has some summary questions at the end to help test your learning. Of course, I highlighted some things that I didn't know from this book using Readwise Reader, and from there brought in those highlights into Obsidian. I also started to think about how I can learn Swedish just by doodling. These are, I guess, my visual doodles or visual notes from a visual note-taking course called Pencil Pirates. And we were talking about the visual alphabet and drawing shapes, not art, but then I also looked up what that means in Swedish. So that's rita former inte konst, I think. Person som springer means a person who's running. Just a little bit of fun to spice things up. I used to use Anki for flashcards, but that doesn't really integrate too well with Obsidian. I've tried those plugins, but I found it a little too convoluted, and I'm really perfectly happy to switch to Obsidian since Anki's interface is just not a great experience. Once you install that app, you can go into the spaced repetition plugin settings here and set tags. Here are some that I've selected for different languages. So I haven't switched all of them in here yet, but I have started to migrate some of my Anki flashcards over, including the ones for Swedish. So I first set these tags here, and then in these settings here, I looked at the separator for inline flashcards and inline reversed flashcards. So the difference is that the inline flashcards only go one way. So if you use the separator, then you might only be shown the Swedish version and you have to supply the English version. But I actually wanted it both ways. So most of the time I do this inline reversed flashcards, which means that every pair that you have is going to be shown twice, once in Swedish and once in English. And that way I can test both my recognition of the Swedish phrase or word and also my active recall of what a certain phrase in English is in Swedish. So you can always set these back to the default. This was already the default one, but for the inline flashcards, it was 2 colons. I didn't really like that, so I wanted to imply a direction, so this is what I put. But most of the time, I just use the reversed flashcards. So after a meeting, I would then copy everything in Swedish, and as part of my processing my notes for that meeting, I just put it in this format. And then I tag it with Swedish or whatever language it is. After that, I then do Command P and type flashcards. You'll see that I already set a shortcut for it. Then I can click on it, and then I'm shown different decks. Each of them corresponds to one of those tags that I showed earlier in the spaced repetition plugin settings. Now I'm still in the process of moving things over. I started to put these in another vault and I'm moving them into this vault. But let's check out the Swedish one. So first it shows how many notes there are for me to review. I don't finish these every day. I mean, 825 notes a day is a lot. But there's also a link to where this word is, and this was useful because I found a lot of things where I was trying to type them in the middle of the call and I might not have typed it out correctly. So this is good for if I want to edit something. Then I could click or just hit enter for show answer. And then I would say whether that was hard, good, or easy. And in these buttons, you see that this one, if I had said that this was hard, then it would show it again to me in 14 days. If I said that this was easy, it'll still show it again in 4.4 months. This is spaced repetition. In a nutshell, it is the idea that repetition is good, but constant repetition for everything is not necessarily useful. So instead, what it tries to do is those words or phrases that you know very well, it'll show you again, but after a longer period of time, and the ones that you're struggling with, you'll see more often. I really like that you can use keyboard shortcuts for this, so I'm hitting enter now to show answer, and I know that it's drinks, so I can do 1, 2, or 3. This was an easy one, so I'll type 3. I början, at the beginning, so enter again, and then I'll also say easy for 3. There's a lot more that this plugin can do. If you want to see more of a deep dive on it, could you let me know in the comments so that I know to prioritize that? Thanks! Now for writing. Now this doesn't always come into play because some languages I learn and I don't really ever need to learn how to write them. But if I'm taking notes from my lessons and putting them in Obsidian, then it is kind of helpful to have some sort of spell check to know that I'm learning the right thing. And for that, I use the plugin LanguageTool Integration. Apparently LanguageTool is a separate service entirely, and you can pay for it. It has a premium version. I'm not really sure what it's for because I haven't paid for it and I'm just on the free version and it works out really well. So if we go into options here, you'll see that if you do pay for the premium version, you can put your API username and key here. But other than that, all you have to do is check this auto check text. And if you're only learning one language, then it might be helpful to select that. But in my case, since I'm learning and typing in a few languages, I just leave it on auto detect. It can be useful when I'm typing something because it underlines this in red. This is in Spanish, for example. And when I click on it, it says error de ortografía. It's kind of cool that this is also in that language. Se ha encontrado un posible error ortográfico. And it says, did you mean hacerlo or hacelo? And then I can select that. And you can add things to your personal language too. The problem with this is I haven't found that it works for all languages equally well. So in Spanish, as you can see, which is a more popular language, it works pretty well. But in Swedish, it can be a little bit hit or miss, I've found. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It gets confused, I think, with similar languages. Like in this case, it understands the Swedish fine, apparently, but not the English because it's still thinking that this is Swedish. So it's a little confusing sometimes, but it still can be quite useful. And it's something that just happens within Obsidian while you're typing. Another thing that I like to do to practice my language is by adding it into my daily template. This is my daily note template, and here in log, sometimes I like to put in what I'm doing in Swedish. I didn't really do that too much with Swedish in particular, but with other languages, I do that a lot, especially this what happened today. What might you want to remember about today a year from now? Because it's kind of cool to have, I guess, journal entries in different languages because that's, part of what I was doing that day. And at the top here, you'll also see that I've been tracking a few things here. This bin stands for binary so that I know it's just 0 or 1 values. And I've been tracking 2 languages that I've been focusing on, Swedish and Portuguese. On any given day, I would switch this to 1 if I have done something in Portuguese or in Swedish. I'm still testing Obsidian Tracker. I do intend to release a video just on that, but here's a sneak peek. Here's how I've been bringing in that front matter for bin Swedish and visualizing it over a month. Now you'll see I haven't done much Swedish recently, but when I was learning Swedish, this is how much I was doing of it. This is like a nice little habit tracker, and it's fun to see those circles connected. If you're curious to see what my results were like after 30 days, here's a cringy but very realistic look at what I was able to achieve after the 30 days. Många möten för jobbar och också för fan, och jag har inte tid för djup koncentration. Det är inte bra för mig.
Nej, det är stressigt.
Ja, stressigt.
Ja.
Och jag tycker om det jag är inte produktiv. Most of us have a tendency to make language learning even more difficult than it already is. Even before we start learning, we already put expectations on ourselves to speak perfectly fluently, to study every day, and to remember a language forever. Personally, I'm exhausted just thinking of that. I've had way more success by setting small and specific goals that I know I'm going to meet, by letting my passions dictate my interests, and by doing fun things like speaking and other things that I would already be doing anyway. I found that if I enjoy the process itself, then I don't mind so much if I forget the language later on. Constantly learning languages is not just what I like to do, it's part of who I am. It's how I connect with people and how I'm able to move to other countries like I do. Check out this video to see how I'm building the life that I want by exploring what other countries have to offer. And it definitely helps to learn the language of those countries. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Tack för att ni tittade!